All right, we're recording. It is January 10th, 2022. Didn't take long to make that mistake. And we've got lots going on today. So let me start off with the v0.4.1 release. There is one PR that I'm hoping to still get in. This is by Steve. Well, no, actually, this is me cherry picking Steve's PR into 0.4. I would love to get this one in as well. I don't know if Brian is on this. Yeah, Brian's not here. Brian had a good question about this, why I was even trying to cherry pick this one back, but essentially it is tightening validation, which is something we consider backwards incompatible. So we're trying to get those changes out while the API is still in alpha. It's really more of a technicality. The thing that we're preventing from happening has no meaning. You know, redirecting to a wildcard domain I don't think it's implementable. So I don't think this is a big thing. I just would rather have it fixed sooner than later. So thanks to Steve for finding this one. And yeah, if anyone has time to take a look at this PR, I'd love to get it in sooner than later. Yeah, that's all for this one. Cool. All right, the next one is anyone interested in being part of a KubeCon maintainer track session this year? We have, I think, a decent chance of getting a session in as a maintainer track for Gateway API this year. KubeCon, the KubeCon EU this year is in Valencia in May. I'm not sure what form that will take. They're definitely planning on a hybrid approach, as with previous KubeCons. But we would have 35 minutes. We have room for up to 4 speakers. But it's worth noting that if you are someone who would already be on another maintainer track session, you can't also be on this one. You can only be on one maintainer track session per conference, apparently. It's not completely guaranteed, but that's the extent of this one. So yeah, if anyone's interested, if you can, I guess, raise that now or message me afterwards. I'd love to have a good set of people to help present Gateway API. I think it'd be great to have some of the people who have been contributing to Gateway API actually be there to talk about it. So again, that's May 16 to 20, but we do need to get a submission in ideally soon. I think we have until February, but I'd love to get something together this week if possible, just so we have an idea of the speakers that might be interested and whatever else. So yeah, if anyone's interested, just ping me and we can get you on the list. Cool. All right, James, I think you're here. Oh, I meant to add more than just this. James has started a good conversation around what helpers would look like. I think we've had this broad idea that it would be helpful to have some basic helper library included in Gateway API itself, which is, I think, a very good idea, something that we've talked about several times now. But James is taking the first step in actually trying to sketch out what an implementation would look like. James has this PR here. I think he shared a couple other gists with me as well of different variations of this take. And maybe, James, I don't know if you want to give a bit of background on what you're thinking here.
Yeah, can you hear me? Am I unmuted correctly?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I have a colleague who's working on a Gateway API implementation. So my perspective is coming mainly as a reviewer, not as a direct author of some of this stuff. So there's some parts around the API that are a little awkward, and one of the things we've done is we've type diffed a lot of the strings so that we can attach validation to it. By the time you get that out into real code, though, it just is a little, your quality of life as a Go language author suffers a little because you have to cast everywhere. So one of the things I was looking at was, can we add some small little helpers to some of the reference types just to make people's code a little cleaner and just to make it a little nicer to work with some of this stuff. So that was the PR that's there. That adds some helper types directly into the Go API types. So I know Rob felt a little uncomfortable about modifying the types that are used to generate the CIDs. So there's a couple of other approaches we could take. So
is that supported by the code generation? Like we can just have a side by side?
Yeah, CodeGen doesn't care.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's supported. It's just it hasn't been done in. The thing that set my alarm bells off is just it's not the way it's done in upstream, but that doesn't necessarily make it good or bad. It's just unfamiliar to me. It is definitely easier to do it this way than the alternatives that James I think is probably about to talk about.
Yeah, but I mean, from a separation of concerns point of view, I think it's like it would be nice to separate the concerns of declaring an API from the concern of declaring an API for the Kubernetes compared to declaring an API for Go. So they are, I do agree, they are things that you can separate, and it's good to keep those boundaries pretty clear. Let me just post a link to the other gist if you want to bring that up, Rob. So here's another approach, which is a separate package. I've called it reference here, and the idea here is to take one of the various reference types and to be able to deal with them in a sort of generic way. So this is just type switching. So say I want to get, at some point your controller needs to resolve references to something, and you say, and lots of our references have this semantic of if the namespace is unspecified, then you use the namespace of the object that's the referee, right? So we can write namespace of in this kind of generic way. We're giving you a parent object and some reference type and consolidating that. So that's code that I've seen in a couple of places, and people end up doing similar things. Getting the name of a reference is also something everybody needs to do, and it's a little awkward because sometimes it's a string, sometimes it's a pointer. Validation in all cases, I think validation defaults the pointer to something, but then as a code reviewer, it feels a little uncomfortable to always depend on the validation having been run. So should you require code to check for a nil pointer or not? Well, it's sort of this non-local decision, right? Has this thing been validated? Can I depend on it later on? But we can remove all that. But we can have a helper function which deals with it, and you can do that for everybody. I'm not super fond of this approach because I think the use of interface is a little ugly. The type switch is a little bit gnarly. Here's a third approach. I just pasted the gist, Rob. So here we're just doing something even more basic. We're just wrapping each reference type in an interface. So we can deal with things as a reference.ref, name, and we get the name, namespace, and kind, which is group kind. And we just have to do like little, copy pasting little wrapper types for all the references. So I guess the question is, will people in the controller community find these sorts of helpers useful? I think there's nothing very, there's nothing very novel here. It's just about improving the quality of life for the community, and maybe consolidating some code, some generic code in the Gateway API repo, so that we don't have to duplicate it across n different controllers.
Yeah, thanks for bringing this up. And I have to say this has resonated with me, because like earlier today, I was reviewing some code where we were doing comparisons that awfully similar to this, that could benefit from a shared helper, and I think anyone who's implementing this API is going to have similar frustrations with all our variety of types that we're using here. So I think that there's a really strong value in having something like this in the Gateway API project. I think I have less of a strong opinion as far as which approach we take, other than that I do, like James has already alluded to, I do like something like that is separated from type definitions. But the details of how we actually implement these helpers are not quite as clear to me, but just I'm glad that you're pushing this forward, because I think it's going to be helpful to anyone implementing the API. Again, that's just my perspective.
Yeah, I think this is a good idea. I just made a minor note that probably whatever approach we take should avoid panic. That's like a Go language thing.
Yeah, that's the problem is that for these kind of little trivial helpers, if you end up having to return errors out of places which, I'm just getting the name of something, then handling propagating the error ends up being more code than dealing with the underlying type in the first place. So it really, I think it discourages the use of it. I think that's I'm kind of leaning towards the second approach, where you wrap a interface around, or you wrap an interface around all your reference types. I think that's preserves the typing better, and it seems pretty clean. And I think it'll end up being reasonably useful.
Yeah, this approach makes sense to me. I think this is very much worth translating back into that PR you started. But I don't know, does anyone else have any thoughts or preference on this? Cool. All right. Well, hey, thanks for getting this started.
So I think we should be able to carry, like, from the code I've seen implementing reference policy, we should be able to write like generic, does reference policy allow this access code that we can carry in upstream that everyone can use.
Yeah, I agree. Reference policy is going to be a good one to make a bit more generic and add some helpers around. I think also how we end up merging route logic, like the route gateway relationship, I think is another one that feels prime for some form of shared helpers around. But yeah, there's a lot of room for developing shared helper code in here. But you have to start somewhere, and this is a good starting point. Cool. All right. Well, thanks for before I forget, let me add this to the agenda so I don't lose a reference to it. But yeah, great. All right. So the next few things are just PR and issue triage. I don't know, is Shane on this call? Yeah, Shane, you're here. Great. I don't think Chow is here. So the first one is actually Chow's PR to add this gap for port matching support. And as of now, I'd say it seems like no one feels very strongly about this one way or another. It's one that I support getting in. but I wanted to leave some opportunity for others to add feedback, add comments, add any kind of hesitation you might have around this. So I guess maybe I'll open it up now. Does anyone feel strongly about the idea of basically adding port to parent ref, which is, I think, really the summary of this gap? I think, James, you added one comment below here.
What was the consensus on the conflict on the semantics of if you put port and section name? I
think the consensus is, and I need to look back at this, but I think they just work on top of each other. They work together.
So
is that, sorry, Rob, is that an and or
yeah, an and? I would say that's an and. Yeah.
Is that defined? I guess we should define that in the gap.
I thought it was, but it's been a while since I've looked at this. Yeah, it is defined.
Okay, got it.
Are there any other questions or comments on this idea?
I think I would like to see an example, a use case using this.
Yeah.
If some kind of example where it's being used.
That's a good point. We usually would have example usage in a gap.
I think that was similar to my comment, because I think to understand the use case, I had to go back to the original issue, which was something about it being hard for service mesh to make use of the section name.
Yeah, that's the primary motivator for this, as I understand it, is again to support attaching routes to specific ports in a mesh use case. But I see this also being generically useful as a way of attaching routes to a port on a gateway. So to me, they seem similar. It's a more generic parent attachment mechanism, but it is most useful, at least from the outside looking in, for the mesh use case. So yeah, some examples of how that would work for both, I think, would be very helpful here. That's a good point.
Yeah, even just adding the reference how they be using the mesh cases will be helpful. A link, your link here.
Yeah. And some notes here.
Yes, so in this case, we have already walked away from that line, but changing implementations or changing gateways will require further more careful changes in the routes as well, right? Like if your route is targeting a different implementation, like we are leaking more and more essentially, right? From that abstraction down to routes. That's like a hesitation that I have.
So I think what you're saying is, I remember like a key goal of Gateway API was that you could change the underlying implementation of the gateway and no one at a route level would need to care, basically, right? That no app developer needs to worry. That I think that's still possible. So maybe explain a bit more how this would pull us away.
I mean, this essentially opens up another place where things could make that possibility a little harder if the user is not aware, right? Section name is, I look at section name and I see that as a little bit of like a small abstraction for that, where you don't have to go and change the port inside the route. Okay, you change it inside the gateway section or the listener section and you're good. So that's like one area where I mean, Hiram's law, right? Like an API, something is possible, it will be used. So that's my hesitation here.
Okay, I get that. I see what you're saying. It's one, it's more things to support, but two, it's the idea that instead of users using this kind of section name abstraction, users are going to see port and say, hey, I should use port to attach to my gateway. And because that's being used as your gateway attachment mechanism, it means that your gateway admin is going to have a difficult time changing the ports the gateway is listening on, because it, and routes are referencing the port numbers directly instead of just an abstract name that can refer to anything.
This feels or smells more like ports are numbers and names inside upstream, and I think that causes a good amount of confusion, I think, in the user. So I think this is like, although we have two separate fields, but we are going essentially towards that. So that's my hesitation and a minor concern.
Good point. Let me. So yeah, basically, if I'm getting this correct, it's reference by port number is going to make it more tightly couple gateway route relationships. Is that a
I think so. Yeah.
And then along with that, it's just too many ways to do the same thing.
I think a bit of examples will sort of help like today and future maintainers a little bit as to why we did it. It is a little, the gap feels a little empty. So.
Yeah.
Is Chow on the call? Can he?
I don't see him.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Should definitely get the examples to kind of motivate this in a concrete way.
Yeah, I'll follow up with him, and I'll add some of these comments just as a follow-up on the GEP itself. Any other comments or concerns on this GEP?
I think like in terms of coupling, that's more of a users ended up using port, because you can always say, hey, if you don't want coupling, you can use section name. But more importantly, it's when, like, why, in what situation would you use port and it's required? And I think that's not probably coming through.
To clarify what you're saying is adding some guidance for when to use port versus when to add section name when you're attaching to a gateway. Is that?
Yeah, because it sounds like we would just recommend everyone use section name. So because it's less coupling.
Yeah.
Do we need to do any specific thinking about the transition? So I'm thinking about everyone has controllers which look at section name, and all of a sudden at some point you'll update your CRDs and you'll get a port number as well, but your controller won't know about it.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that transition look like?
This is going to be that's a good question. It's a much broader conversation about how do we handle. I think what it would have to be is every gateway implementation is going to have to recognize the version of the CRD, the max version of CRDs it supports, and then log some kind of warning when it detects a CRD that is newer than it is aware of, or that is an unrecognized version, because I think that's essentially the bounds in which that would happen. And in that case, I think you need to log errors, warnings, whatever it might be.
So this would be This would be like a V1 alpha 3 change.
No, so
It's actually an experimental. So I think it would be similar to how Kubernetes, you can have an old controller talking to a new API, and the old controller just wouldn't know about the new fields. Something like
yeah,
that.
so
Yeah, but that's not. I don't know what the right
I mean, you
terminology
do
is.
need
It's
to
not
spit out a
operationally
warning.
it's not operationally compatible, right? Because you're
no, you're
asking for
right.
you're asking for something, and the controller's not doing the thing that you asked for.
Yeah, you're right. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this problem, and part of this is the whole bundle versioning that's been proposed, right? So starting with 0.5.0, our next minor, hopefully beta API release. Every CRD is going to, actually, I think it's already in the code now. Every CRD is going to include 2 annotations, one being the track, the channel it's on, so stable or experimental, and 2 being the bundle version that it was released with. So I think right now we have 0.5.0-dev is the track, that the bundle version that our CRDs on master have. But the idea is that any consumer of the API, any client of the API is going to look at that bundle version and say, I recognize this, I support this, or this is a version I don't recognize, I don't know anything about, and therefore I should log some kind of warning that I don't support some form of function. I don't know what functionality is in this API that I don't support, but the latest version I do support is this. And if you're trying to use anything beyond that, I may not support everything. I think that's really the best we can do here. Does that help solve, or?
And we have given a little bit of room where implementers can choose, like they can fail as hard or as soft as they want in that area.
Yeah. And so if you consider that those changes would only ever occur along the boundary of a version bump, like, and what I'm meaning is not like a V1 alpha 2 version bump, I'm meaning a bundle version bump, then I think as an implementation, you can safely say, I support the concepts of the APIs that I like. These are the versions I recognize of this API. And if I see something like outside of those bounds, I will do X. I think the most safe thing to do is just log a warning. But you could also fail harder than that if you wanted to. Yeah, I don't know.
Where does the bundle version come from?
It
Like,
is
probably
it's just our semantic versioning, but it's a label. I can't remember if it's a label or annotation, but it's something like on every CRD. It's already included in master. It's just not in any released version of the CRDs yet.
Okay, let me grab for that.
Yeah, this is I had a gap relatively recently that was about how we would handle this release versioning, and I hope this approach is sensible. But yeah, we're trying to build out a whole new system of doing things. So hopefully this approach makes sense. Cool. Any last comments on this gap or versioning in general?
Hey everybody. Not
Hey.
so much on the versioning, but the gap. So it seems to me, I think, so where I have pause is some of the confusion this might bring up, and this is partially to Harry's point. So there's section name, which the way name is listed in listeners is a unique key. So there needs to be one of them. Port will then match across listeners, right? So 80 could select on multiple listeners. So it seems like we're partially broadening the matching, as opposed to, should we think about fully broadening it and make port a field, a type, and a path? So someone could select any slice of listeners. So I'm wondering if we're just partially moving forward, and then we're going to have another problem down the road.
I can't remember who suggested, it might have been James had a comment that was awfully similar to this in scope of, is port sufficient, or are we just going to add a protocol next, or whatever other component would be next in line here? And that's very possible. I think you're right that does feel like the slippery slope we're on, that we could very easily keep on expanding this. Port, I think, is a pretty well understood concept to me, and as is protocol, I suppose. And but I think just because we could add more at this point, I don't know that we need to. I think that port has a fairly clear use case, and we have demand, request, whatever for it. Whereas attaching to protocol, for instance, or to, I don't know what we can already attach to host name, so I can't think of any other dimensions you might want to attach for a listener.
I think protocol is already implicit. So specifically for protocol, it's already somewhat implicit in the type that's being attached. Mostly, yes. But mostly.
HTTP route, you could say, I only want to listen on like HTTP versus HTTPS. I think we have a differentiation on the listener.
Right.
So
yeah.
I don't know. I should take a step back though. Mikhail, is that something that you specifically have a use case for, or is it just kind of an abstract idea?
Hello everyone, this is Michael. So I just wonder if this new field reflects the personas of the gateway APIs, and like for non-service mesh use case, like do application developers who publish the HTTP routes, do they really need to know like the this level of details, like a port number?
Yeah.
Or should it be like the concern of the cluster operators only, for them to provision, specific listeners for specific ports, and then share that information with the application developers?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have run into weird edges around our personas, like you're alluding to here. It's hard to build a system that fits everyone's boundaries perfectly. But you're right. In an ideal world, you have those really strong boundaries, and your gateway admins, your application developers, your route admins don't need to know about a port number necessarily. But in other cases, I do think that it's at least plausible that a application developer really cares about the port number specifically that their application is exposed on. I don't know.
I think this question will again, like, we can't probably answer it completely, but the why, the use cases, I think is missing, and that's making it a little harder to grasp again.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that would definitely be helpful. Right? Like, so you guys both brought up that there are other ways to match, right? Protocol is assumed in or implied in certain route types. And then host name can match directly from the routes, right? Because they have a set of their own host names. That's the other little pause that I have, and I don't have a great alternative, so I'm just kind of bringing things up. And I don't have a use case outside of just discussing this. But then, there's this orthogonal matching of section name and then port name, and then spread across the API space, there is host name and then implied matching with protocol. And I think it like bears more reflection on like what kind of system the users or what kind of workflows the users are going to have, and how are they going to kind of reason about the API. So I'm glad you're bringing up the discussion, and I'm just discussing. Like I said, I'm still trying to work around a good input to the gap, but since you brought it up, yeah.
No, to kind of take Matthew, sorry, Rob.
Go ahead.
To kind of run with Matthew's, I think Matthew's point a little bit. So the context here is, someone's using a parent ref to a mesh CRD. Well, I mean, a mesh can have arbitrary fields that aren't in gateway, which you might want to match. So maybe you have multi-mesh, right? So you have like 6 different meshes, or meshes have particular properties. Maybe in the context of mesh, it makes sense to say, hey, I want this route in my production mesh, and I want some other route in my developer mesh. In which case, what are you matching on from parent ref?
Yeah, you're right. And it does depend on how you structure that parent resource. You're entirely right. So it's going to be implementation specific, I would think. But in my mind, there's a difference. If your example is a good one of, I have 2 different meshes. One is production, one's non-prod, whatever, right? That could, again, depending on implementation, be represented as different instances of a mesh. This is a mesh resource that represents my prod mesh, and this is a mesh resource that represents my non-prod or dev, whatever mesh. And that works. That's entirely possible. So that's a parent ref that is, referencing a different resource entirely. Another way to take that is I'm going to have one resource that includes 2 nested items. One is it's not a listener, but it's basically a parallel concept for mesh. I haven't seen a resource like this, but you can imagine that there's a mesh, and within that definition of a mesh, you have, here's my prod section and here's my non-prod section. And so you can imagine, okay, you could use section name to reference that. Both of those seem like a reasonable approach here. But the key with those examples is you're talking about something that is relatively finite in terms of the quantity. So you could represent it with additional resources. Whereas asking someone to create additional resources for every port, 60,000, a large number of resources for each port may be a bit overkill. And I think port is somewhat unique in that it is broadly applicable for both use cases. Like it's clearly something that is desired for at least some mesh implementations. But I think it's also clearly understood and has some valid use cases for gateway, where the other examples probably don't. So that's my take on it, but I don't know, interested in other discussion here too. And I do know we should move on soon. So I don't want to keep on dragging this out, but this has been awesome conversation. Thank you to everyone who's contributed to it. I'll try and summarize some of the comments here in one broader comment, but certainly this is PR966. If you have comments or thoughts, please add them on the PR as well. It'd be great to get some discussion going on there as well. Great. All right, well, thanks everyone. The next one, Shane, I think you're still on the call. This one is L4 traffic matching, which also has a few outstanding conversation items here. Shane, what questions do you think need to be answered at this point? I know there's a couple outstanding conversations at least.
Yeah, it ended up, it was an implementation for the GET, but I think we ended up having a lot of comments about just basically extending the original GET PR discussion. So things are changing a lot. There's a couple that I just need to go back over. I just need to catch back up on this week. And I think there are some, like you pinged someone and they haven't chimed in yet. Kind of just waiting on consensus for a couple of them. So I'll make sure tomorrow I get back to kind of just giving it a good once over.
Okay. No, thank you for driving this. I know this turned into a bit of a large discussion here. I think one of the things I remember as being
Better now than beta.
Right. Yes, I agreed. One of the things I remember as being kind of a key point here is around the address types and specifically how we represent them. So one of the key parts of this PR right now is it splits out address type into two types. I forget the specifics, but one is for use in gateway and one is for use in L4 routes, essentially. I forget what each is called. And the reason or go ahead.
No, it's just split because we didn't want host name in the L4 validation.
Yeah, and so I guess this all comes back to which is the least bad way to do this. So in our type definitions, what we're doing right now is we have this awfully fun idea of putting our enums on the type definitions themselves. And so that means if you have a variation in the values allowed, you need a new type definition instead of putting your enum where it's used. So the alternative would be to take this and pull it up to where it's actually used in the gateway and on the route and say, on the gateway, you can use these 3 values and on the route, you can use these 2 values, right? And I don't think we have developed a clear practice one way or the other on this. It's just, this is kind of that discussion coming to a head.
Yeah, and I also did try the inverse. So the inverse is instead of the original address type being used basically by the new type and then getting host name, I did the reverse where the new one becomes the base type and then gateway tries to just add the host name. But that ends up in some weird validation generation. So I just decided to split it. Like it just ends up looking goofy.
Yeah. Good to know.
I want to, can we scroll down to the thread that I think James started? I think he had a good point about, I'm not sure if that thread was going in the right direction. Yeah, this one, where we should be matching. I'm speaking for James here a little bit, so James, please correct me, but I think we should be sort of matching the structure of the route, similar to HTTP route rather than like, that's a simpler API where we have homogeneous routes rather than every route having a spec that is wildly different.
Yeah, I owe Shane a bit of an apology on this one because I clearly didn't. I think I didn't actually review the original GEP, and that's something that it would have been better to raise in the first round.
Well, no, I mean, better to get it now than beta for sure. Let's get it figured out. I think I get where you're coming from, like kind of flattening things out. But I think that where we left off in that conversation was, at least in the original GEP, we had talked about just having like address match. And then in this suggestion, it's kind of splitting out what was eventually, let me rephrase myself. Address match had this concept of maybe eventually that could include sitters. And this kind of goes a different way and says that like matching on network be a separate thing, which I'm not opposed to at all. It's kind of just an unresolved thread at this point that I need to get back to.
Yeah, I think the idea here is just to mirror the pattern that we've established in HTTP route, where you have a list of matches, and each match has a list of has some number of fields which can be matched against. So source address is one field, destination address is another field. You could quite easily imagine where I did there, network address as something that matches against CIDR. And then you can put all them, you put all those matches in your traffic match, maybe you can call it traffic match struct or address match. And then you combine them with an OR at the top level in your slice, which is what HTTP route does.
So I think it's okay to now not add like cider matches in this gap. I think that can be a future addition, but that and or matching of, you have multiple matches which are all independent, but within a match you have and logic. I think that is, I think, more important in my
Yeah, I
view.
think the
Well, I
network
may have been-
matching, the network matching later is fine. I probably muddied the issue a bit by mentioning it here.
Well, the sitter part was already kind of mentioned as a, we're not doing this for this gap. So that is kind of meant to be for later anyway. The part that I might be a little confused on is you asked for a list of these kind of topical matching structures. That is implemented. I immediately saw the value of that and put that in. But are we still trying to get more underneath that? Because the or was that list, right? And we have that now.
Yeah, yeah. So if you have the or at the and so I'm just scrolling around in in the UDP route. Say look in TCP route rule, we have matches, which is a slice of address route matches. So the address route, what I think we should do is the matches would be a slice of address route match. And that slice gives you the OR semantics, which means that any one of these matches is acceptable. And then in address route match, I'm gonna turn off comments because I can't find anything this yeah, in address route match, we would specify one source address and one destination address.
Gotcha.
And they would have and semantics. So if you specify both of them, it would mean this matches when the source address is A and the destination address is B.
Yeah. Now I don't mean to put you on the spot, and please feel free to say no, but if I gave you like write access to my fork, would you want to help me co-author this and just add the changes you're looking for?
Yeah. I mean, I can just send you a diff or a gist or something. I'm happy to do that. I can just send you a diff later on today if you like.
I think what might make sense if we're talking about fundamental changes like that, maybe we should take a step back and try to modify the gap first, and then once we have consensus on the gap, come back here, because like you said, there's a million comments and it's hard to follow what we're suggesting here. I see the merit of trying to match more closely HTTP route and the matching semantics there. I am concerned. Again, it's hard to predict what users are going to want, but for example, they may want to have be able to configure a situation where I want to match any one of these addresses, requests from any one of these addresses to any one of those addresses, which I don't think is possible with the structure you've proposed, James, like the single address to single address kind of relationship.
Well, it is, because you can have multiple matches. So
right, but so basically what I'm saying is a many-to-many relationship is difficult to model that way, because then you need, I can't imagine how an exponential number of rules in that case.
But it's only the difference is just where you put the slices, right?
I think
you're expressing the same thing. It's just you've used a slightly different. We've used a slightly different structure. The YAML structure is different, but the semantics you can express are the same.
I think it's more than that if you pair source and destination together as a one-to-one match. That's my concern. But this is going down into more detail than we need to discuss here. I think it's very worth following up with a get PR. Just so, because I may be misunderstanding. I probably am misunderstanding what you're proposing. So maybe just taking it a step back and making some proposed suggestions to the get be the best next step. I don't know.
I'm for either. That sounds good. Or just, if you want to just put a patch in. I do think I need to see it a little bit, and I don't know if I can reason about it on this call right now, because it's like 7 and I've been on since 9 and my brain's fried. So
yeah, I'll put something together. I'll follow up with Shane.
Cool. All right. Thanks. All right, I think we're on to the, well, actually, I shouldn't move on quite that quickly. Was there anything else we should cover on this?
I think on the Rob, the comment you're going down to, if there are slices at both the layers, then we can probably solve the problem.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, hopefully, yeah. Well, I want to actually see this written out, and hopefully it'll make more sense to me then. Yeah. Okay, so the last one is conformance test. I appreciate all the feedback we've gotten on this one. This is a huge PR, and this is the, like, I think V3 of this PR. Like there's some code that's been recycled from earlier versions of this PR. I really do think this is close to, if not ready. I would appreciate some additional rounds of review on it. Some of the things that have changed more recently, I've added a new flag that basically allows you to run tests without cleaning up the base resources, so you can leave the base resources intact between test runs. Variety of other tweaks, changes, etc., cleanup. From what I can tell, these tests work reasonably well. I have not found an implementation yet that they pass 100% on, but I haven't run it on that many either. But I think this is a close to good starting point. And I'm at a point where I've seen, you know, conformance test PRs stagnate, and I would really love to just get this one across the finish line, whatever that takes, just so we can have some baseline for conformance tests and then iterate from there. So I don't know if anyone's had a chance to look at it, or if anyone has questions or thoughts on the general direction. Happy to discuss anything here. But if not, it's really just, I think, a request for a bit more review.
I've been running a little behind on reviews, but I'll take a look. It seemed like I think at this point we should get something in and, like, you know, just go and iterate and, you know, collect feedback. Like we have, like you have said before, right? Like they've gotten stale a lot of times, and I think it's a lot of effort to create even like one version. So yeah.
Cool. Well, yeah, I appreciate that. Any feedback here would be awesome. I'm happy to. I've got some time where I can spend on this and iterate as need be, but I'm also trying to not balloon this PR into something bigger than it already is. So I'm trying to restrain myself from adding anything else or making big changes until we can get this one in, and then I'll keep on going a bit. But yeah, especially if you have an implementation or anything that works against V1 Alpha 2, I'm interested in trying to run this, hear your experience, trying to integrate, see where expectations may not line up, whatever it is, or even just the test structure itself. Yeah. Okay, well, if there's nothing more on this, I think that may be all for today. Did anyone have anything else that we should discuss? Cool. All right. Well, welcome back. Happy New Year, everyone. And we'll see you online and hopefully next week as well. Have a great one.
Thanks, everyone.